Donald Trump just threatened 100% tariffs on any country that tries to replace the US dollar. But here's the problem. 3 African nations are already full members of BRICS. Nigeria just became a partner country in January 2025, and together they're sitting on some of the world's richest gold and resource reserves while actively working to ditch the dollar. Africa isn't just joining the dollarization movement. Africa is becoming the center of it, and the US is watching its century-long financial dominance crumble one African nation at a time. Let's start with what BRICS actually is, because if you're only hearing about it now, you're late to the party. BRICS started in 2006 as an acronym coined by a Goldman Sachs economist named Jim O'Neill. He looked at Brazil, Russia, India, and China and predicted they'd become future economic powerhouses. He was right. These 4 countries formed an official cooperation bloc in 2009. South Africa joined in 2010, turning BRIC into BRICS. For years, it was mostly a talking shop, a place for emerging economies to meet and complain about Western-dominated financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. But then something changed. In August 2023, BRICS invited 6 new countries to join: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. By January 2024, 4 of them officially joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. Argentina backed out after electing a pro-US president. Saudi Arabia is still playing both sides, taking meetings with BRICS while simultaneously announcing trillion-dollar investments in America. And in 2025, Indonesia became the 10th full member. But here's where it gets interesting for Africa. At the October 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, the bloc invited 13 nations to become BOLA, partner countries, a new status that's not full membership but gives them a seat at the table. Nigeria, Algeria, and Uganda from Africa were among them. Nigeria officially accepted in January 2025, making it BRICS' first West African partner. So let's count. Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa are full BRICS members. Nigeria, Algeria, and Uganda are official partner countries waiting for full membership. That's 6 African nations already inside the BRICS structure, with several more expressing interest. And these aren't small, irrelevant countries. Nigeria has 220 million people, Africa's largest population. Egypt has 110 million. Ethiopia has 120 million. South Africa is the continent's most industrialized economy. Between them, they represent massive markets, enormous labor forces, and unbelievable natural resources. Now here's the part that should terrify Washington. These African BRICS nations control strategic resources that the entire global economy depends on. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, one of the world's most critical trade choke points. Ethiopia controls the source of the Nile River. Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer and has massive natural gas reserves. South Africa produces 70% of the world's platinum, critical for electronics and catalytic converters. Egypt and Ethiopia combined have 230 million people in strategic positions connecting Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And all of them are now committed to reducing dependence on the US dollar. Why does this matter? Because for 80 years, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. After World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement made the dollar the global standard. Every country needed dollars to buy oil, to trade internationally, to hold reserves. This gave America an extraordinary power. They could print money, run massive deficits, impose sanctions, and control global finance because everyone needed dollars. But that system is cracking, and Africa is leading the charge to break it. Let's talk about how BRICS is actually attacking dollar dominance. It's happening in 3 major ways: gold accumulation, local currency trade, and alternative payment systems. First, gold. In 2024, central banks worldwide added 1,045 metric tons of gold to global reserves, marking the 3rd consecutive year that annual purchases exceeded 1,000 tons. BRICS nations are leading this gold buying spree. China, Russia, India, and other BRICS central banks are quietly stockpiling gold as a hedge against dollar exposure. Why? Because gold can't be sanctioned, frozen, or devalued by American monetary policy. Russia learned this lesson the hard way when the US froze Russian dollar reserves after the Ukraine invasion. Now Russia, China, and other BRICS nations are converting dollar reserves into gold as fast as they can. Central banks worldwide hold about 35,940 tons of gold, more than 20% of all gold ever mined. The US still holds the largest official reserves at 8,133 tons. But here's what's changing. Emerging economies, especially China, India, Poland, and Turkey, are rapidly increasing their holdings. BRICS nations collectively hold massive gold reserves, and they're discussing a gold-backed digital BRICS currency that would bypass the dollar entirely. Physical gold reserves would back each digital unit, bringing stability and reducing transaction fees. It's Bretton Woods 3.0, except this time the West isn't in control. Second, local currency trade. BRICS nations are ditching the dollar for bilateral trade and using their own currencies instead. China and Russia now conduct over 90% of their trade in yuan and rubles, completely bypassing the dollar. Brazil and China signed a yuan-real trade settlement agreement in 2023. India is purchasing Russian oil in rupees. India and Russia are conducting 90% of bilateral trade in local currencies, with a target of $100 billion in trade by 2030. In August 2023, the UAE's Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and India's Oil Corporation conducted their first crude oil transaction using the local currency settlement framework, paying in rupees instead of dollars. Indonesia and India agreed in January 2025 to use local currencies to promote bilateral trade. Even countries outside BRICS are watching and copying this model. The renminbi is already used in 50% of intra-BRICS trade. Think about that. Half of all trade between BRICS nations no longer uses dollars at all. That's trillions of dollars in annual transactions that used to flow through dollar-denominated systems, now completely bypassing them. Third, alternative payment systems. For decades, SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, has been the dominant system for international money transfers. It's based in Belgium but heavily influenced by the US, which is why America can use SWIFT access as a sanction weapon. When the US kicked Russia out of SWIFT after the Ukraine invasion, it proved to every country watching that the dollar-based financial system is a political weapon that can be used against them. So China built CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, which facilitates yuan-based transactions independently of SWIFT. As of January 2025, CIPS has 1,467 indirect participants across 119 countries, linking 4,800 banks in 185 countries. It's still smaller than SWIFT, but it's growing fast. At the October 2024 BRICS Summit in Kazan, members discussed developing BRICS Pay, a decentralized payment system allowing countries to trade in local currencies without touching the dollar or SWIFT. It's still being developed, but the intent is clear. Build a parallel financial system where America has no control. Now let's bring this back to Africa, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Africa has everything BRICS needs to make de-dollarization work. Massive populations, huge markets, critical resources, and governments that are tired of Western financial control. Nigeria alone has 220 million people and vast oil and gas reserves. It's Africa's largest economy and most populous nation. When Nigeria joined BRICS as a partner in January 2025, it signaled that West Africa, historically dominated by French and American influence, is now pivoting toward the BRICS bloc. Egypt joined as a full member in January 2024. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, through which 12% of global trade passes. If Egypt decides to accept yuan or other BRICS currencies for Suez Canal fees instead of dollars, that's a massive blow to dollar dominance. Egypt is also a major recipient of US foreign aid and military support, which makes its BRICS membership even more significant. It's a country straddling both worlds, and it's choosing to bet on BRICS. Ethiopia joined as a full member in January 2024. Ethiopia has 120 million people and controls the source of the Nile River, giving it strategic leverage over Egypt and Sudan. It's also one of Africa's fastest-growing economies. Ethiopia's membership signals that even landlocked African nations see BRICS as their economic future. South Africa has been a BRICS member since 2010, the only African nation in the original bloc. South Africa produces 70% of the world's platinum, a critical mineral for electronics, automotive catalytic converters, and hydrogen fuel cells. It also has significant gold, diamond, and rare earth mineral reserves. South Africa has been pushing hard for African representation within BRICS and advocating for the bloc to focus more on African development. At the July 2025 BRICS Summit in Rio de Janeiro, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa made a powerful statement. "We value the BRICS principle of mutual respect and the recognition of sovereignty and equality among all member states. It is unacceptable that major countries like India and Brazil are still excluded from meaningful participation in the UN Security Council." We are pleased that there is growing consensus within BRICS on the urgent need to reform the United Nations Security Council to make it more democratic, representative, and inclusive. Ramaphosa also insisted on the importance of value addition and beneficiation of Africa's critical minerals. He said, "We were rather pleased that the summit addressed key issues such as the treatment of critical minerals, many of which are sourced from African countries. There was consensus that these minerals must not be exported in raw form only. Instead, there should be beneficiation and value addition on the continent to ensure that Africa fully benefits from its own natural resources." This is huge. For decades, Africa has been exploited as a source of raw materials. Minerals extracted, shipped to Europe or China, processed into valuable goods, and sold back to Africa at markup prices. BRICS is offering a different model. Keep the resources, process them locally, build industries, create jobs, and capture the full value chain. And crucially, do all of this trade in local currencies or yuan, not dollars. Let's talk about Trump's threat, because it reveals both America's desperation and its leverage. In December 2024, Trump posted on Truth Social, "We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency, replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy." In July 2025, he escalated, threatening an extra 10% in tariffs on countries even discussing de-dollarization. Brazil's President Lula da Silva responded directly, "BRICS Plus is committed to ending US dollar dominance no matter what." That's not diplomatic language. That's a declaration of economic war. And here's the thing. Trump's threats might work on small countries dependent on US markets, but BRICS nations collectively represent 46% of global GDP and 55% of the world's population. They're not small, they're not dependent, and they have each other as alternative markets. Take Nigeria as an example. Currently, Nigeria's largest trading partners are India and China, both BRICS members. If the US imposes 100% tariffs on Nigerian goods, Nigeria doesn't collapse. It just shifts more trade toward BRICS partners who are actively seeking Nigerian oil, gas, and agricultural products. Same logic applies to Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa. They're joining BRICS precisely because they want to reduce dependence on Western markets and Western currencies. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is important. Despite all the hype, a unified BRICS currency is not coming anytime soon. At the July 2025 BRICS summit in Rio, hosted by Brazil, the topic of a common currency was barely discussed. Putin and Xi Jinping didn't even attend. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar stated clearly in March 2025, "I don't think there's any policy on our part to replace the dollar. The dollar as the reserve currency is the source of global economic stability. And right now what we want in the world is more economic stability, not less." Why is India backing away? Because India doesn't want to replace dollar dominance with yuan dominance. China's economy is 5 times larger than India's. If BRICS creates a common currency, China would control it. India sees that as trading one master for another. Russia has also backed away from openly calling for a BRICS currency after Trump's election, trying to placate the new US administration to get sanctions relief. So here's the reality. BRICS won't create a single currency that replaces the dollar overnight. What they're actually doing is much smarter and more sustainable. They're slowly building parallel financial infrastructure, trading in local currencies for bilateral deals, accumulating gold as a dollar hedge, creating alternative payment systems like SIPS and BRICS Pay, and establishing institutions like the new development bank that lend in local currencies instead of dollars. It's death by 1,000 cuts, not a single dramatic coup. And Africa is absolutely central to this strategy. Here's why. Africa has 1.4 billion people, 30% of the world's mineral reserves, massive arable land, and the youngest population of any continent. By 2050, Africa will have 2.5 billion people, a quarter of humanity. Whoever controls economic relationships with Africa controls the future. China understood this decades ago with the Belt and Road Initiative, investing hundreds of billions in African infrastructure. Now BRICS is formalizing that relationship, bringing African nations into a bloc that offers an alternative to Western-dominated financial systems. For African nations, BRICS offers something the West never did: a partnership without colonial baggage. The IMF and World Bank come with conditions, austerity programs, and policies that benefit Western corporations. BRIC's new development bank lends without those conditions, respecting each country's sovereignty. China, India, and other BRICS members invest in African infrastructure, build power plants, construct railways, and develop ports without lecturing about governance. Is it perfect? No. Critics rightly point out that China is creating debt traps through Belt and Road loans, that BRICS members like Russia and China have terrible human rights records, and that replacing dollar hegemony with yuan hegemony isn't liberation. All true. But from an African perspective, BRICS is leverage. It's an alternative. It's a way to play competing powers against each other instead of being completely dependent on one. Nigeria's partnership with BRICS is a perfect example. Nigeria can now negotiate better terms with Western partners by threatening to deepen BRICS ties. It can attract Chinese and Indian investment by offering access to West African markets. It can demand technology transfer and local manufacturing as conditions for resource extraction. That's agency. That's sovereignty. That's what BRICS offers that the old system didn't. Let's talk about gold one more time, because it's the secret weapon in all of this. In 2024, central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold for the third straight year. BRICS nations are leading this buying spree. Why? Because gold is the ultimate hedge against both dollar dominance and currency instability. When you hold gold, you have value that can't be sanctioned, frozen, or inflated away by another country's central bank. For African nations that have watched Western powers freeze assets, impose sanctions, and manipulate currency values, gold represents security. South Africa, as one of the world's largest gold producers, benefits directly from rising gold prices driven by central bank demand. Egypt has been increasing its gold reserves. Even Nigeria, which historically held minimal gold reserves, is now exploring increasing its holdings as it deepens BRICS ties. A potential gold-backed BRICS digital currency would give these nations a stable store, a value for trade that doesn't depend on trusting any single country's monetary policy. Here's the bottom line. The US dollar isn't going to be replaced tomorrow. The dollar still accounts for 59% of global foreign exchange reserves as of 2024, down from 85% in the 1970s but still dominant. The dollar is still used in roughly 89% of currency exchanges and 56% of all foreign currency reserves as of November 2025. No other currency comes close. The yuan represents only 2% of global payments through SWIFT, despite being used in 50% of intra-BRICS trade. The gap between BRICS ambitions and BRICS reality is enormous. But here's what's undeniable. The trend is moving away from the dollar. Every year, the dollar's share of reserves drops a bit more. Every year, more trade happens in local currencies. Every year, more central banks buy gold instead of dollar-denominated bonds. Every year, alternative payment systems grow stronger. And every year, more African nations join BRICS or express interest in joining. This isn't a revolution, it's an evolution. And Africa is driving it. The US can threaten tariffs, but it can't stop this trend without destroying its own economy. American consumers depend on imports from BRICS nations. American corporations have massive investments in BRICS countries. Imposing 100% tariffs would spike inflation, crash stock markets, and trigger a global recession that hurts America as much as anyone. Trump knows this. His threats are negotiating tactics, not serious policy. Meanwhile, BRICS keeps growing. At every summit, more countries apply for membership or partner status. Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Turkey, and other major economies are now BRICS partners. If even 10% of global trade shifts from dollars to local currencies over the next decade, that's trillions of dollars in reduced demand for US currency. That means higher inflation in America, higher interest rates, more expensive government borrowing, and a declining standard of living. For Africa, this represents the most significant economic opportunity since decolonization. African nations can finally leverage their resources, their populations, and their strategic locations to demand fair partnerships instead of accepting whatever terms the West offers. They can trade with China in yuan, with India in rupees, with Russia in rubles, and with each other in their own currencies. They can build infrastructure with BRICS financing instead of IMF loans. They can process their own minerals and capture full value instead of exporting raw materials for pennies. This is why Donald Trump's threats won't work, because Africa isn't begging to join BRICS. BRICS is recruiting Africa. And for the first time in centuries, African nations have options. They have leverage. They have alternatives, and they're using them. So the next time you hear about BRICS, don't think of it as just another international organization. Think of it as the beginning of the end of American financial dominance, and recognize that Africa is leading the charge. 3 African nations are already full members. 3 more are partners waiting for full membership. Dozens more are watching and considering their options. And all of them are sitting on resources the world desperately needs while actively working to trade those resources without using dollars. The American century is ending. The multipolar century is beginning. And Africa, after 500 years of exploitation, is finally getting a seat at the table where global finance is decided.